my name's Nate Smith. I'm the Gretchen Augustine Director and Curator here at the Dinosaur Institute. And I want to welcome you all to Dino Fest again, and thank you for joining us for our second Digging Deeper Dino discussion. Today we're welcoming Dr. Balanoff. She's going to be talking about the evolution of the bird brain and origins of flight. In more than 500 million years of vertebrate evolution, howard flight is only known to have evolved 3 times: in bats, pterosaurs, and of course, in birds. This talk will explore the Mesozoic origin of avian flight from the perspective of the dinosaur brain. Now, Amy is an assistant professor in the Center for Functional Anatomy and Evolution at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She holds appointments in the Division of Paleontology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Department of Paleobiology at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. She received her PhD from Columbia University, and research in her lab focuses on the interplay between behavioral innovation with anatomical structure and function during the transition from the primarily 2-dimensional environment of ground-dwelling dinosaurs to the 3-dimensional environment experienced by most birds today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Balanoff.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you for coming out for this talk today. This is very, very exciting to be able to talk to you all. Tell you all a little bit about what I do in my research, which, as Nate just mentioned, is a lot about using the brain to understand the deep history of behavior. And so to do that, I bring together anatomical data about the structure of the brain with more experimental data about how animals are actually using their brains. And then I try to put this all within this larger evolutionary context so that we can know something about the origins of behaviors and how these different relationships might have changed through time. My research focuses within this group here called amniota, and amniotes include mammals and reptiles being inclusive of birds. And it's within amniotes that we see several instances of brain size increase. This happens, of course, within our own lineage of mammals, but it also happens within birds. And so to just kind of drive home what might be kind of surprising to some people, let's look at brain size, relative brain sizes. So what we're looking at here is a chart of body size along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, and brain size along the y, the vertical axis. And this outline here is basically encompassing the distribution of relative brain sizes for squamates. And squamates are lizards and snakes. This outline essentially encompasses that range of relative brain sizes for mammals. And you can see that it lies above the squamate outline. And what this means is that for a given body size, a mammal is going to have a larger brain than a lizard or a snake would. So let's throw birds into the mix here. And so here is our bird outline. And you can see it falls right on top of that mammal outline. So there really is broad overlap between these two groups. And the mammal distribution is even being skewed a little bit because here we are as humans, and of course we have very large brains for our body size. But let's look at a few other mammals just for fun. Here is the relative brain size of a rabbit, so right within that bird, right in the middle of that bird distribution. Here is the relative brain size of a galago, which is a primate. Again, well within that bird distribution. We're starting to edge towards the top, but really within that distribution. And then here is the relative brain size. This is a Cercopithecus monkey, which is a primate that is more closely related to us than that galago was. Again, within the bird distribution, we're getting towards the top at this point, but still within the range of birds. And if we looked at other things like neuron numbers or structure of the brain, we would see very similar patterns to what we see with brain size. And so let's look at some of the structure of the brain. So on the left is a primate brain, on the right is a bird brain, and they share a lot of things in common. If you kind of squint and look at them, they do kind of look alike, kind of similar, but both of them share this really large cerebrum, a large complex cerebrum, which is the part of the brain that is responsible for processing higher cognitive abilities. So things like planning for the future, that takes place within the cerebrum. They both have a large cerebellum, which is the part of the brain that is responsible for using sensory information to plan and coordinate movements. They also have, this is a short medulla, we're not going to talk about that today, so I'm not going to really focus there. They both have small, well, primates and birds have small olfactory bulbs, which are the part of the brain that's processing the sense of smell. There's some differences here as well. Birds have very large optic lobes. This is the part of the brain that's processing visual information. Birds are very visual animals, so they have, this is a very large region of their brain. But in the long run, most of these similarities that we see between the mammal and bird brains are independently evolved. And we can say that because we have a pretty good idea of what the amniote tree looks like. And in fact, if we look at the brain of if we look at the brain of birds' closest living relatives, that of crocodilians, like this alligator here, what we see is that their brain really does not look much like a bird brain. So alligators have this very elongate structure. They have very large olfactory bulbs that are almost as big as their cerebrum. They have a small unfolded cerebellum, so et cetera, lots of differences between bird brains and alligator brains. Which means that, okay, I am gonna wander here for a moment. What this means is that in this part of the tree from the split at Archosauria between these crocodilians and birds, that space, that long space on the tree, that is the part of the tree where the modern bird brain takes shape. That's where the evolution of the modern bird brain takes place. Now, what I'm interested in is understanding what are the volumetric and structural changes that actually produce the modern bird brain? Because like mammals, bird brains are able to support all sorts of very complex behaviors, things like sociality or tool use. Birds have lots of complex behaviors that are supported by their brain. And as I said, it's within that one part of the tree from that Archosaur split up to the evolution of living birds in this 140 million years or so that the modern bird brain takes shape. Now the problem is that part of the tree is populated entirely by extinct animals. So how do we ever know anything about the evolutionary timing or tempo or the context in which these characters appear? Well, this is where we're kind of lucky because this is where we have a pretty good fossil record. So this is where things like pterosaurs and all of the non-avian dinosaurs like ornithischians and the saurischans, including theropods like Tyrannosaurus rex, and more bird-like things within Paraves and Archaeopteryx. All of this stuff falls within this part of the tree. And these fossils provide us small windows into the evolutionary history of characters. And so, a lot of the characters that we initially thought were stereotypical of living birds, well, it turns out that they have a much deeper history among the non-avian dinosaurs. So to just give you a few examples, feathers. Everyone thinks of a bird when they think of feathers, and yet I'm going to say, depending on how you want to define a feather, you could push it all the way back to pterosaurs, which means that feathers would have evolved before dinosaurs did. Alan mentioned a wishbone. Well, wishbones show up within this group of dinosaurs called theropods, so at the base of theropoda. Therefore, Tyrannosaurus rex has a wishbone. Even behaviors can show up within the fossil record. And so this dinosaur here is sitting or brooding on a nest of eggs, just like we see modern birds do. So it's sitting on the nest, keeping those eggs warm. And so these fossils really do show us these small windows into this evolutionary history. Now, what about the brain? Because the brain is a soft tissue structure that doesn't really preserve very well in the fossil record. So how do we ever know anything about the evolutionary history of the brain? Well, this is where we can use what are called endocasts. And an endocast is simply an infilling of the cranial cavity where the brain sat during life. So essentially, in things like mammals and birds that fill the majority of their cranial cavity with their brain, the brain actually leaves an imprint on the internal surface of the brain case. So if you can fill in that space and then get rid of the surrounding bones, you have a cast of what the brain would have looked like during life. And so that is what we call an endocast. And these days we can make endocasts pretty easily. We can just use CT scans to, just like, if you went to the hospital and had a CT scan of your head, help the doctor look inside of your head. Well, we can look inside the heads of these animals to digitally prepare endocasts. So all we have to do is fill in that cranial space and get rid of the bones around it, and then stack these slices up to make three-dimensional models of the brain. And so here are a couple of examples of endocasts. So we can do this fairly easily for living birds. So the movie on top is showing an albatross, a modern albatross. And you can see the endocast looks a lot like that brain, that bird brain that I showed you earlier. On the bottom is the endocast of an oviraptorosaur dinosaur. So this is an animal that went extinct somewhere around 90 million years ago, and yet now we have an idea of what its brain looked like during its lifetime. And just to show you a couple, here's just an array of different endocasts that I'll be showing you throughout the rest of the talk. Okay, so once we have endocasts, we can begin to ask some more interesting questions. Remember, I showed you that chart of relative brain sizes. The bird brain sizes were larger, relative sizes were larger than the squamates were, right? So those other reptiles. So one thing that I'm interested in is, where does that shift, where does that increase in brain size occur? And so using endocast data, what we can do is to fill in some of the gaps here. So this is another evolutionary tree. You have non-avian dinosaurs on the top, kind of pushed further to the left, and modern birds on the bottom of this tree. And so when we look at endocast sizes of all of these animals, what we find is that at this group called pair aves, which includes things like Velociraptor, Troodon, Archaeopteryx, plus living birds, it's at the base of this group that we see a significant increase in relative brain size. So pair aves, once again, is where we see this increase. What's really interesting to me is that you don't see another significant increase in brain size until well within living birds. So what this means is that birds like ostriches and emus, ducks and chickens, even pigeons and flamingos have a similar relative brain size to Velociraptor. So just kind of put things in perspective a bit. And to keep putting things in perspective, we can look at what some of these brain sizes, what this actually translates to. And so you can see the relative brain size of Tyrannosaurus rex compared to an African elephant. And we all know that all know that elephants are pretty smart. And honestly, to me, like, yes, the relative brain size of that African elephant is larger than Tyrannosaurus rex, but the Tyrannosaurus rex is still pretty big, honestly. And he's not even a para-avian. So let's look at some of the para-avian dinosaurs. So again, here's our relative brain size of T-Rex compared to overall skull size. But here's the relative brain size of a troodontid. So it just shows you, like, some of these non-avian dinosaurs were probably kind of, I don't know, probably pretty kind of scary smart, honestly. All right, so now that we have this framework, what we can do is start asking questions about how brain sizes relate to behavior. And what I'm particularly interested in is the locupatory behavior of powered flight. So most birds are capable of powered flight. And so I'm interested in what is the relationship between brain size and powered flight. So if we expect there to be a relationship, we would expect to see brain size increase at the same time that powered flight evolves. And in fact, that's kind of what we see. So here's pair 80s, where we saw that increase in brain size. This is actually one of the hypotheses based on skeletal information for the evolution of powered flight potential. So, Alan showed you a lot of these dinosaurs. They certainly all couldn't fly, but there is potential for powered flight on this part of the tree. So it seems like there is a coordinate relationship between these two things. Now, the only thing is that relative brain size is made up of two things, right? So it's made up of body size and brain size. So we have two variables making up relative brain size. And we actually went in and looked at how these two variables were evolving independent of each other on the tree as well. And what we found is that at pair 80s, what's actually happening is both brain size and body size are decreasing at this part of the tree, but body size is decreasing faster than brain size. So what you end up with actually is an overall larger relative brain size. So what's probably happening here is that selection is actually acting primarily on body size, and that probably has something to do with the evolution of flight itself. And what might actually be a better question to ask is how particular parts of the brain are evolving either in response to or with powered flight. But to get at that question, we really need to know how birds are using their brain during flight. So is there anything about brain activity that would suggest that we should see changes in the brain related to flight? So this question, well, one, you'd be surprised how little information there is out there regarding this question. And so this pushed me into some more experimental work using PET scanning to construct basically activity maps of the brain in flying birds. And so what this allows us to do is draw this direct line of inference from the activity of the brain to the anatomy of the brain to the deep history of the brain that we can get from endocast. So I'm just going to take you through kind of how these experiments work. Here's our highly technical setup here with the white bucket. And these are the pigeons that we used for these experiments. And so what we would do is we would inject the pigeons with a radioactive tracer. It's the same radioactive tracer that's used in humans when you do PET scanning on humans. So it's not harmful to the birds at all. And we would inject them with the radioactive tracer. We would then have them either just sit on a perch for 10 minutes, or we would have them fly back and forth between two perches for about 10 minutes. That's about how long it took that radio tracer to get taken up by the brain. After that, we would put them in the PET scanner and scan them. And then we can look at the differences in brain activity going from rest to flight. And so the middle row here is what the PET data look like. And then we can then overlay these data onto atlases of the brain, or essentially maps of the brain, in which we had identified regions that we were interested in looking at. And so once we have this, we can then quantify the changes in activity from rest to flight. And so here are the results. I don't expect you to read this chart. I just want to mention that one of the overall patterns that really surprised me is that most of the brain is kind of stable during flight. So we don't see major changes in activity levels from rest to flight. All of the significant increases that we did see were concentrated within the cerebellum. And this actually makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you remember what I said about the cerebellum, but a lot of what it is doing, it has a lot of functions, but some of its primary functions are to take this sensory information in. So information like visual information, somatosensory information coming in, that's a sensation of touch coming in from the body, vestibular information, which is about balance and orientation. So it's taking all of these types of sensory information to basically inform the body on how to move. So how to plan, or it's using it to plan, coordinate, and then execute movements. So it does, like, the cerebellum being active during flight is actually almost exactly what you would expect to see. And so now that we have this information, we've got the activity information. It seems like the cerebellum is kind of the key region for flight. We've tied that to the structure of the brain, and now let's take a look at the deep history of the brain that we can see in EndoCast. And to make this a little bit more meaningful, I've divided the EndoCast into different structural regions so that we can ask the question, what is the relationship of the cerebellum to powered flight? And so here's a chart of relative cerebellar size. And what I want you to take away from this is that we do see an increase in relative cerebellar size within non-avian theropods, but it's not at that paravian group. It's actually at this group called Maniraptora. And just to, again, we'll go back to this slide. Basically everything on the slide that's outside of that black box is a Maniraptoran dinosaur. So this is where we see that increase in cerebellar size. All right, so how does that relate to flight? Obviously that's not paraves, there's paraves. Our hypothesis for powered flight potential. Here is Maniraptora. So you can see that Maniraptora is a more inclusive group than paraves is, which means that the cerebellum increased in size before the evolution of flight. Now, this doesn't negate our original hypothesis. All this means is that flight-ready brain is in place before the actual evolution of flight. All right, so what I think the importance of this kind of work as a whole is really in this relationship, in establishing these direct lines of inference from things like activity data to anatomy to the deep history, because these types of integrative cross-disciplinary studies are what are going to show us what the neurological basis of some of these very famous evolutionary transformations is. Using a wing to fly. So what we might actually be looking at here is an important evolutionary step in the construction of the modern flight apparatus and its neurological basis. All right, so with that, I'll just thank you for being a very